Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment, taking a look at the 5th Vice President of the United States, Elbridge Gerry. I am flying solo, of course, for the audio portion here. Part 1, we took a look yesterday at his early life and kind of his early political life. And, of course, his time with the Continental Congress and signing the Declaration of Independence and all that good stuff. Now, we're going to take a look a little bit deeper into his political career and then the vice presidency and just some fun facts and gravesite and all that stuff. And that's what part 2 will be. So, let's jump right in without further ado, as they say. Elbridge Gerry served in the United States House of Representatives during the First and Second Congress from 1789 to 1793. A conciliatory and moderate legislator, he supported Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's proposal to fund the Revolutionary War debt and to establish a national bank. Disillusioned by the increasingly partisan nature of the debate that Hamilton's proposals generated, Elbridge Gerry retired at the end of his second term, returning to Elmwood, his Cambridge, Massachusetts estate, to attend to his business affairs and to care for his large and growing family. He had remained a bachelor until the age of 41, marrying Anne Thompson, the European-educated daughter of a wealthy New York merchant, in 1786. Anne Gerry's frequent pregnancies, 10 children arrived between 1787 and 1801, placed a severe strain on her health, and Elbridge was needed at home. Gerry's brief retirement ended in 1796, when he served as a presidential elector, supporting his friend and former colleague John Adams. In 1797, with relations between the United States and France steadily worsening after the adoption of the Jay Treaty, President Adams appointed Gerry an envoy to France. The mission failed after representatives of the French government demanded a bribe before they would begin negotiations. Gerry's fellow commissioners left Paris, but Gerry, who had been meeting privately with the French in an effort to facilitate negotiations, remained behind, believing that a combination was possible. Eventually, he left France empty-handed, but convinced that his efforts had averted war. Attacks on American shipping continued, however, and Gerry was widely criticized for the failure of the mission. Maligned by Federalists who believed him partial to France and courted by Republicans for the same reason, Gerry tried to remain aloof from the partisan warfare of the late 1790s. Then, in 1800, energized by President John Adams' warning that Hamilton would use the army to gain control of the government, he aligned himself with the moderate wing of the Jeffersonian coalition, eventually emerging as the leader of the Massachusetts Republicans. After a brief second retirement from politics between 1804 and 1809, Gerry was elected governor of Massachusetts in 1810. The success of his efforts to reconcile Federalists and Republicans, who were bitterly divided over foreign policy issues, led to his re-election the following year. During his second term, however, Governor Gerry adopted a more hardline approach as Massachusetts Federalists became increasingly outspoken in their opposition to Madison's foreign policy. He prosecuted Federalist editors for libel, appointed family members to state office, and approved a controversial redistricting plan crafted to give Republicans an advantage in the state senatorial elections. The Federalist press responded to this plan with cartoon figures of a salamander-shaped election district, the Gerrymander. adding to the American political lexicon a term that is still used to connote an irregularly shaped district created by legislative fiat to benefit a particular party, politician, or other group. Governor Gerry's highly partisan agenda led to his defeat in the April 1812 gubernatorial election. Heavily in debt after co-signing a note for a brother who defaulted on his obligation and saddled with expenses of a large family, Elbridge Gerry asked President James Madison to appoint him Collector of Customs at Boston. So just a little bit extra here about gerrymandering. I'm going to read you something about that. Who was the Gerry of gerrymandering? Let's see how I can kind of start this for you. Here we go. Elbridge Gerry was born on July 17th of 1744. He was a native of Marblehead, Massachusetts, and both his parents were linked to the merchant business. Gerry took up the trade in 1762 and became an exporter of cod, a profitable fish upon which countless fortunes have been built. At age 28, he won a seat on the colony's general court where he'd come to share Samuel Adams' revolutionary rhetoric. In 1776, Gerry joined the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Throughout his tenure there, Gerry demanded pay raises for Patriot troops, earning him the nickname Soldier's Friend. The merchant's integrity was widely admired even by John Adams, who was notoriously hard to impress. "He is a man of immense worth," wrote the future president. "If every man here was a Gerry, the liberties of America would be safe against the gates of earth and hell." In 1787, with the war over, Gerry took part in the Constitutional Convention. The importance of his presence cannot be understated. After all, it was he who moved to include a Bill of Rights, an idea that his colleagues shot down. 5 days after the proposal, the newly completed Constitution was ready to be signed. Since a Bill of Rights was nowhere to be found, Gerry, along with just 2 other delegates who made it to the end of the convention, withheld his signature. A subsequent letter to the Massachusetts state legislature explained this choice. "It was painful for me, on a subject of such national importance, to differ from the respectable members who signed the Constitution, but conceiving, as I did, that the liberties of America were not secured by the system, it was my duty to oppose it," Gerry stated. He may have lost that battle, but he ultimately won the war, thanks in part to dissenters who, like him, a 10-amendment Bill of Rights was formally adopted on December 15th of 1791. Had he retired from politics right then and there, Elbridge Gerry might have gone down in history as the father of the Bill of Rights. Instead, he is remembered first and foremost for another, less admirable claim to fame. Massachusetts made Gerry its 8th governor in 1810. By then, America turned into a nation divided. 2 rival parties now split the electorate: Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans and the late Alexander Hamilton's Federalists. Gerry belonged to the former group, which backed his successful re-election campaign in 1811. At the time, Democratic Republicans represented the Massachusetts legislature's majority party. This gave them enough votes to pull off a rather devious scheme that secured big wins in the state Senate 1 year later. The plan was brilliant in its straightforwardness. Early in 1812, Democratic Republican legislators laid out new districts which shoehorned most Federalist Party supporters into a handful of precincts. Behind closed doors, Governor Gerry denounced this plot, calling it highly disagreeable. Unfortunately, that did not stop him from signing the proposed new districts into law anyway. The result was a monstrously slanted election season. Overall, Federalist candidates for the state Senate earned 1,602 more votes than their Jeffersonian opponents did. Yet because of these new precincts, the Democratic-Republican Party nabbed 29 seats to the Federalists' 11. The new state electoral map looked positively absurd. Thanks to partisan manipulation, districts now came in all manner of irregular shapes. Particularly infamous was one such division in Essex County. To the staff of the Weekly Messenger, a prominent Federalist newspaper, this squiggly precinct looked like a mythical salamander. Thus the name Gerrymander was born, and it stuck. The Federalist surge meant that Gerry was ousted from office, but Gerry's career was not quite over. On the contrary, it saw a swift rebound when James Madison chose him to become his second vice president the following year. But like Madison's previous vice president, Gerry did not last long. Death took him while he was still in office. Those interested may find his grave in the capital city of the nation he helped create. Nestled inside Washington's Congressional Cemetery is Elbridge Gerry's tomb. Above it sits the first monument ever funded in full by the federal government, where visitors can read Gerry's personal creed. It is the duty of every man, though he may have but one day to live, to devote that day to the good of his country. And thus, gerrymandering was born. So there you go. Pretty interesting little side note. All right, let's get back now. First, though, before we get to his vice presidential career, let's take a look at the election of 1812. Yes, that is the election in which Elbridge Gerry became vice president of the United States. Definitely important for us to take a look at here. So here, let me pull this up. And here you go. So the 1812 United States presidential election, it was between James Madison, who was the Democratic Republican. He was going against DeWitt Clinton, who was a Federalist from New York. James Madison from Virginia. DeWitt Clinton's running mate was Jared Ingersoll, and the running mate of James Madison was Elbridge Gerry. It was a pretty they won pretty handily. They carried 11 states to 7, 128 electoral votes to 89. But there you go. That is how Elbridge Gerry became Vice President of the United States in the election of 1812. Madison had other plans for Gerry. With the 1812 presidential election fast approaching and the vice presidency vacant since George Clinton's death in April, Madison was more anxious to find a suitable running mate than to fill a customs post. He preferred a candidate who would attract votes in the New England states, yet would not threaten the succession of the Virginia dynasty in the 1816 election. Former Senator John Landon of New Hampshire, the party's first choice, was too old and too ill to accept the nomination. After he declined, the Republican caucus turned to the 67-year-old Gerry, a choice that Madison approved despite Albert Gallatin's prediction that the Massachusetts Patriot would give us as much trouble as our late vice president. Gerry had supported Jefferson's embargo and Madison's foreign policy, remaining steadfast after the United States declared war against Great Britain in June of 1812. Like Madison, he believed that the war was necessary to protect the liberties that both men had labored so hard to secure during the Revolution. Although Elbridge Gerry was certainly no liability, he turned out not to be as valuable an asset as the Republicans had hoped. Of Massachusetts' 22 electors, only 2 voted for Gerry and none voted for Madison. In an election that was, as one scholar had observed, a virtual referendum on the War of 1812, editors and electioneers paid relatively little attention to the vice presidential candidates. By a margin of 39 electoral votes, Madison defeated opposition candidate DeWitt Clinton, and Gerry triumphed over Jared Ingersoll of Pennsylvania. Gerry remained at home in Massachusetts on Inauguration Day, March 4th of 1813, taking his oath of office there from United States District Judge John Davis. When the Senate convened at the beginning of the 13th Congress on May 24th of 1813, he appeared in the chamber with a certificate attesting to the fact that he had taken the oath of office. Gerry's inaugural address, an extended oration condemning the British and praising Madison, was unusual in content and length. He explained that to have concealed his political principles and opinions during a crisis like this might have savored too much of a deficiency of candor. He was now on record as a supporter of the war effort and a loyal ally of the president. Gerry's early hopes that unanimity should prevail in the Senate soon faded. As the war deepened the divisions between the parties and threatened to split the Republican coalition. Republicans far outnumbered Federalists in the Senate, but mounting opposition to the war effort among disaffected Republicans steadily eroded the administration's 28-8 majority. The president was such an inept commander-in-chief that even his loyal ally, House Speaker Henry Clay of Kentucky, considered him wholly unfit for the storms of war. As anti-administration sentiment reached a fever pitch after American forces suffered humiliating defeats in Canada and at sea, several members of the president's party balked at the nomination of Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin as envoy to Great Britain and Russia. Instead, they supported a resolution ordering Madison to inform the Senate whether Gallatin would retain his cabinet post, and if so, who would serve in his absence. Ultimately, these Republicans joined with Federalists to defeat the nomination by a vote of 18-17. Elbridge Gerry found it increasingly difficult to remain impartial in such a highly charged atmosphere, especially after Madison became seriously ill in mid-June of 1813. Gerry himself was in poor health. He had recently suffered a stroke, and old age had so withered his slight physique that one observer likened his appearance to that of a scant-patterned old skeleton of a French barber. The March 1st, 1792 Act, which at the time governed the presidential succession, provided that if the president and the vice president died in office, a development that many considered possible, if not imminent, during the summer of 1813, the president pro tempore of the Senate would serve as president. And if Gerry left the Senate before Congress adjourned, as all of his predecessors had done to allow election of a president pro tempore, anti-administration forces might combine to elect an individual hostile to Madison's agenda. One Federalist editor had already suggested New York Federalist Senator Rufus King as a possible successor, while Secretary of State James Monroe warned that disaffected Senate Republicans had begun to make calculations and plans founded on the presumed death of the president and vice president, and it has been suggested to me that Virginia Senator William Branch Giles is thought of to take the place of the president of the Senate. But if Gerry remained the chair, and if he survived until the end of the session, the person next in line of succession would be Speaker of the House Henry Clay, an outspoken war hawk. Breaking with the precedent established by John Adams, Gerry therefore refused to vacate the chair, presiding over the Senate until the first session of the 13th Congress adjourned on August 2nd of 1813. Several gentlemen of the Senate had intimated a wish that he would retire from the chair 2 or 3 weeks before the time of adjournment, and would thus give to the Senate an opportunity for choosing a president pro tempore. He later explained, but other gentlemen expressed a contrary desire and thought that the president should remain in the chair and adjourn the Senate. Gerry ultimately decided that, as a war existed and had produced a special session of Congress, he was differently circumstanced from any of his predecessors and was under an obligation to remain in the chair until the important business of the session was finished. Decades later, in March of 1890, the Senate established the current practice of having presidents pro tempore hold office continuously till the election of another president pro tempore, rather than serving only during the absence of a vice president. With the presidential succession safe and Madison's physical condition much improved by the time the Senate adjourned, Gerry was free to return home. He was absent when the second session of the 13th Congress convened in December and did not return to Washington until early February of 1814. Partisan sentiments remained strong in the Senate, he soon discovered. By one observer's count, the administration's opponents outnumbered its supporters by a margin of 20-16. The vice president suspected that a Senate stenographer was the source of a recent anti-administration articles in the local press, but with opposition forces now in the majority, he was reluctant to meddle with serpents, and he left the matter dropped. Unpleasant as his Senate duties had become, Gerry still enjoyed the endless round of dinners, receptions, and entertainments that crowded his calendar. With his elegant manners and personal charm, the vice president was a favorite guest of Washington's Republican hostesses, including First Lady Dolly Madison. He maintained an active social schedule that belied his advanced years and failing health, visiting friends from his earlier days who were now serving as members of Congress or administration appointees, and paying special attention to Betsy Patterson Bonaparte, the American-born sister-in-law of Napoleon, whose revealing attire caused a stir wherever she went. Gerry remained in Washington until the second session of the 13th Congress adjourned on April 18th of 1814, leaving the Senate chamber only a few moments before adjournment to permit the election of South Carolina Republican John Gaylord as president pro tempore. Mindful that the war had increased his responsibility and apprehensive of the tendency of contrary conduct to prostrate the laws and government, however, he had refused to relinquish the chair whilst any important bill or measure was pending and was to be finished at that session. Elbridge Gerry spent the summer of 1814 in Massachusetts, awaiting news of the war effort from Madison. He found the capital much changed when he returned in the fall. British troops had burned most of the city's public buildings, including the Capitol, and the Senate would meet in temporary quarters for the remainder of his term. He was outraged to learn that the Massachusetts Federalists had called for a convention of the New England states to consider defensive measures and to propose constitutional amendments. In the fall of 1814, the Hartford Convention, which would not issue its recommendations until after Gerry's death, was widely rumored to be a secessionist initiative. The vice president therefore urged Madison to counter with a spirited manifesto against the proceedings. Elbridge Gerry was still an energetic defender of the administration and of the war, but by that autumn, his public responsibilities, coupled with his relentless socializing, had sapped his strength. He became seriously ill in late November of 1814, retiring early on the evening of November 22nd and complaining of chest pains the next morning. Determined to perform his public responsibilities, he arrived at the temporary capital in the Patent Office building later that morning. Then, Realizing that he was in no condition to preside over the Senate, he returned to his boarding house. Members of the Senate, assembling in the chamber at their customary hour and hearing reports of Gerry's death, sent Massachusetts Senators Joseph Varnum and Christopher Gore to the Vice President's lodgings to ascertain the fact. When they returned with confirmation that the reports were true, the Senate appointed 5 senators to a joint committee to consider and report measures most proper to manifest the public respect for the memory of the deceased. The body then adjourned as a mark of respect to its departed president. On the following day, the Senate ordered that the president's chair be shrouded with black during the present session, and as a further testimony of respect for the deceased, the members of the Senate will go into mourning and wear black crepe round the left arm for 30 days. Although the Senate passed legislation providing for payment of Gerry's vice presidential salary to his financially strapped widow for the remainder of his term, the House rejected the plan. Not long after Elbridge Gerry's interment at Congressional Cemetery, the United States claimed victory over Great Britain. The young nation received a few tangible concessions from the British under the Treaty of Ghent, but a new generation of leaders viewed America's victory in the War of 1812 as a reaffirmation of the ideals that had animated and sustained Elbridge Gerry since the summer of 1776. So there you go, bit about Elbridge Gerry and his life and his legacy and all his doings in politics. I'm going to read a couple other things to you here, interesting things about Gerry. First and foremost, something that obviously he's pretty, well known for is the XYZ affair. President Adams appointed Elbridge Gerry to be a member of a special diplomatic commission sent to Republican France in 1797. Tensions had risen between the two nations after the 1796 ratification of the Jay Treaty made between the United States and Great Britain. It was seen by French leaders as signs of an Anglo-American alliance, and France had consequently stepped up seizures of American ships. Adams chose Elbridge Gerry over his cabinet's opposition on political grounds that Gerry was insufficiently Federalist. Because of their long-standing relationship, Adams described Gerry as one of the 2 most impartial men in America, Adams himself being the other. Gerry joined co-commissioners Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and John Marshall in France in October of 1797, and met briefly with Foreign Minister Talleyrand. Some days after that meeting, the delegation was approached by 3 French agents at first identified as X, Y, and Z in published papers, leading the controversy to be called the XYZ affair, who demanded some substantial bribes from the commissioners before negotiations could continue. The commissioners refused and sought unsuccessfully to engage Talleyrand in formal negotiations. Believing Gerry to be the most approachable of the commissioners, Talleyrand successfully froze first Pinckney and then Marshall out of the informal negotiations, and they left France in April of 1798. Elbridge Gerry, who sought to leave with them, stayed behind because Talleyrand threatened war if he left. Gerry refused to make any significant negotiations afterward and left Paris in August. By then, dispatches describing the commission's reception had been published in the United States, raising calls for war. The undeclared naval quasi-war followed. Federalists, notably Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, accused Gerry of supporting the French and abetting the breakdown of the talks, while Adams and Republicans such as Thomas Jefferson supported him. The negative press damaged Gerry's reputation, and he was burned in effigy by protesters in front of his home. He was only later vindicated when his correspondence with Talleyrand was published. In response to the Federalist attacks on him, and because of his perception that the Federalist-led military buildup threatened Republican values, Elbridge Gerry formally joined the Democratic-Republican Party in early 1800, standing for election as governor of Massachusetts. So there you go. Gerry is generally remembered for the use of his name in the word gerrymander, of course, for his refusal to sign the United States Constitution, and, of course, like I just read, for his role in the XYZ affair. His path through the politics of the age has been difficult to characterize. Early biographers, including his son-in-law, James T. Austin, and Samuel Eliot Morrison, struggled to explain his apparent changes in position. Biographer George Athan Bilius persists that Gerry was a consistent advocate and practitioner of republicanism as it was originally envisioned, and that his role in the Constitutional Convention had a significant impact on the document it eventually produced. Gerry had 10 children, of whom 9 survived into adulthood. Gerry's grandson, Elbridge Thomas Gerry, became a distinguished lawyer and philanthropist in New York. His great-grandson, Peter G. Gerry, was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives and later a U.S. Senator from Rhode Island. Gerry is depicted in 2 of John Trumbull's paintings, the Declaration of Independence and General George Washington's resigning his commission. Both are on view in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. The upstate New York town of Elbridge is believed to have been named in his honor, as is the western New York town of Gerry. The town of Phillipston, Massachusetts, was originally incorporated in 1786 under the name Gerry in his honor, but was changed to its present name after the town submitted a petition in 1812 citing Democratic-Republican support for the War of 1812. Gerry's Landing Road in Cambridge, Massachusetts is located near the Elliott Bridge, not far from Elmwood. During the 19th century, the area was known as Gerry's Landing, formerly known as Sir Richard's Landing, and was used by a Gerry relative for a short time as a landing and storehouse. The supposed house of his birth, the Elbridge Gerry House, it is uncertain whether he was born in the house currently standing on the site or an earlier structure, stands in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and that town's Elbridge Gerry School is named in his honor. So there you have it. A look at the life of Elbridge Gerry, legacy of Elbridge Gerry. Interesting guy. He is buried, now just to talk real quick about his gravesite, he is buried at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Very interestingly enough, very cool. Obviously, he's got a very cool monument there. It's neat. It's a nice little obelisk and monument. From what I just read, the first federally funded monument to be erected. It's just cool. It's just very cool. I like it, at least. He did, of course, he did die. It was a sudden heart attack that killed him in 1814. He died in Washington, D.C. He's buried there, of course. And then his widow, Anne, she would live to 1849. So she would live another 35 years after him. And she actually was the last surviving wife of a signer of the Declaration of Independence to die. So she actually ended up being the last surviving widow of a member that signed the Declaration of Independence. So Elbridge Gerry, his gravesite there in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. And then, of course, Anne Gerry, his wife, his widow, she's buried in New Haven, Connecticut, at the cemetery there. So pretty cool stuff. There you go, guys. A look at the life, legacy, vice presidency, the term gerrymandering, the XYZ affair, all of it, surrounding our 5th vice president of the United States, Elbridge Gerry. I hope you enjoyed this this vice presidential series installment. Really enjoying doing this. It's very interesting to me. I hope you guys, my voice cracked a bit. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I hope you're learning some things. I'm definitely learning a lot of things when I research these guys. So it's a lot of fun. So stay tuned next week, our next Vice Presidential Series installment, and we'll be taking a look at the 6th Vice President of the United States, Daniel D. Tompkins. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, guys. Thanks for all the support. Thank you for everything you guys do. You guys are the best. I mean that sincerely. Please keep those comments and questions coming. Ask me questions about this vice presidential stuff. Love hearing from you guys. It's great. And stay tuned. You definitely have bonus footage coming up at the end here for Elbridge Gerry. So stay tuned for some Gerry bonus footage. And we will see you next week. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now. So, hey guys, TJ back with you for part 2 bonus footage. Now this time, this is actually videos and photos that I've taken. So there is bonus footage here that I've actually done myself. One thing I did want to mention real quick, the merchandise is real close to dropping. I'll be sharing the link how you guys could order shirts and coffee mugs and hats and all that stuff when I get it finally up and running. There is going to be a fun hashtag. One of our subscribers actually created this, and I thought it was so clever and so funny. And I'm going to throw it up on the screen right now. Hashtag here for Henry. Because I think most of you don't care if I'm on the screen, but all of you love when Henry's up there, and all of you love seeing him, and which is awesome. So that's going to be the new hashtag. Hashtag here for Henry. You're going to see me using that a lot on my Instagram posts and TikTok posts, and we're even going to have t-shirts with our logo on it, and underneath the logo, we're going to have hashtag here for Henry. I thought it would be really kind of fun. It'll be a brand new little hashtag fun thing that we're doing. So, yeah, hashtag here for Henry. So now, let's jump into the bonus footage. The first thing you're going to see here is actually the gravesite of Anne Thompson Gerry. Yes, Elbridge Gerry's widow, his wife. Just so you know, she actually outlived Elbridge by, I want to say it was like 30 years. I mentioned it in the video, but it was literally like something like 30 years. It was a long time that she outlived him by, or even like it might even been like 35 years. So after that, she actually lived and was supported by her children. She lived with her son, James Thompson Gerry. She also, at least 2 of her daughters lived with her at 17 Temple Court in New Haven, Connecticut. And that's actually where she died. She died in New Haven, Connecticut on March 17th of 1849. And she is buried at the Grove Street Cemetery, which is a very famous, beautiful, old cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut. That's where she's buried, the Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut. And you will actually see some other Gerry family members buried right by her in this plot, in this Gerry plot. So here you go. Take a look. The gravesite of Elbridge Gerry's widow, his wife, Anne Thompson Gerry, along with other Gerry family members. Grove Street Cemetery, New Haven, Connecticut. Take a look. Hey guys, how's it going? I am here in New Haven, Connecticut, and right there behind me. Let me flip you around here. So this is actually the Gerry plot here in New Haven. This right here, this is actually Anne Gerry. This is Elbridge Gerry's widow. This was his wife. She died obviously much later than Elbridge did. But also, here's Elbridge Gerry the second. Here's Thomas Gerry. Those are both his sons. And then you have his daughters here. You have Helen. You have Anne. Then you have Eleanor. And then you have Emily. So all of his children, except for I think there's like one or two that are not buried here, but all, for the most part, of his children, 2 sons and 4 daughters, and his widow, are right here in New Haven. Not really sure what that is. His one daughter, real daughter, but pretty good. Pretty cool stuff. And Gerry, Elbridge Gerry's wife and widow, buried right here in New Haven, Connecticut. So there you go. Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. So one of the last things I was going to do when I was going to go down to Washington, D.C. to visit Elbridge Gerry's gravesite again was I was going to take some video there, of course, which I didn't get to do. And I was also going to take a look at the, I believe it's the seven buildings. I believe, yeah, it's called the 7 buildings. They were 7 townhouses constructed on the northwest corner of Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest in Washington, and this is actually where Gerry lived and where he died. However, those 7 townhouses have been long destroyed. There's office buildings and everything else in its spot, but there is, I think, one facade. There's one side that has a facade that was the original 7 townhouse, 7 building, and I was going to go take photos of that. But I'm not even going to include anything like that in this because, you know, that was going to be something separate. But what I'll show you now is all of my photos from Elbridge Gerry's gravesite. Of course, on November 23rd of 1814, Elbridge Gerry fell seriously ill while visiting Joseph Norse of the Treasury Department, and he died not long after returning to his home in the 7 buildings. And Elbridge Gerry is buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., with a memorial by John Frazee. He is the only signer of the Declaration of Independence who was buried in the nation's capital city. So, pretty cool stuff. He's actually the only vice president buried in the capital city as well of Washington, D.C. So, here's his gravesite at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., This is when I visited there last year in 2020 during the pandemic. Here you go. Elbridge Gerry's gravesite, Congressional Cemetery, Washington, D.C. Thanks, guys. Again, I apologize for the lack of bonus footage. I gave you guys some stuff, but I wish I had more of my own footage, that I would have been able to show you. I apologize. Can't control the traffic and that sort of thing, so I apologize, guys. So I will see you guys next week. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now.